Welcome to the Dawn to Dusk podcast with your host, Douglas Wood, author of From Dawn to Dusk, How to Build a Multi-Million-Dollar Law Practice and Then Give It Away. In each episode, Doug speaks with distinguished legal professionals who have mastered the intricacies of building a successful law practice and then transitioning to retirement or other fulfilling pursuits when the right time comes. Now, let's join Doug for today's insightful discussion.
Today's guest is David Miraldi, a seasoned personal injury lawyer who managed something rare in our profession. He left the law not in exhaustion or bitterness, but with intention, and then reinvented himself as a storyteller who shines a bright, unflinching light on the American justice system. After decades in the courtroom, David faced a moment of reckoning at age 59. A health scare, thankfully resolved, forced him to confront a question many lawyers avoid. What do I want to do with the rest of my life? His answer was bold. He stopped accepting new cases, tried or settled every matter remaining on his docket, and by 2015, stepped away from a career that had defined him. For the next several years, he stayed on to support his firm behind the scenes, but the center of gravity in his life had already shifted. Freed from the grind, David turned to writing, and the results have been remarkable. He has now published 4 books, 3 of them narrative nonfiction in the tradition of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, peeling back the layers of human conflict and legal complexity with a novelist's instinct and a trial lawyer's eye for the truth. His newest book, The Edge of Guilt, released this past summer, is inspired by real events. One review appraised it as a taut, true events-inspired story with late-breaking, hard-hitting chapters that deliver actual shock and awe. His work is gripping and deeply informed by a lifetime inside the justice system. In our conversation today, we'll explore how lawyers can move beyond the grind, reinvent themselves, and continue contributing in creative, meaningful, and unexpected ways. David's journey takes us from the dawn of building a litigation practice through the turning point when he stopped taking on new cases, and then to the dusk where he redefined his purpose through storytelling, reflection, and legacy. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be here.
So let's start right off with why you became a lawyer. What enticed you to want to be a litigator, and how did that journey start?
I became a lawyer because of my father's example. My father was the son of Italian immigrants. He worked his way through Oberlin College, enlisted in the Navy in World War II, captained a minesweeper, and went to law school on the GI Bill. Over the next 25 years, he started with nothing and built a practice, and he was widely accepted as probably the best trial lawyer in the area. And as a kid, my brother and I admired my father. He would come home. He apparently thought that the attorney-client privilege didn't apply at home. So he would talk about his cases, and he would ask our opinions and what we would do. And so, of course, we became very involved with what the law had to offer. And he was also pretty savvy. He told us that we shouldn't become lawyers. He knew that children always do the reverse of what their parents say. But we did not follow his advice. Both my brother and I went to law school, and rather than take opportunities with a larger firm, or for my brother's case, a judicial clerkship, we came home to work with him. And it was a decision I have never regretted. He unfortunately was diagnosed with cancer 5 years after I joined him, and he was gone 2 years later. But those 7 years in which I was not just his son, but was his colleague, I wouldn't trade those for anything. So that's why I became a lawyer.
So in those years, other than obviously the great fulfillment you had in working with your dad, what other senses of fulfillment did you have as a personal injury lawyer?
When I first joined the firm, we were an insurance defense firm. My father had won some cases as a plaintiff's attorney, but it was before the days of advertising. It was all on reputation, and he wasn't sure what cases were going to come in. And several insurance companies contacted him, said, "Hey, would you represent us?" And so he said yes. I will say that my brother, and actually my dad, we never fully embraced being insurance defense attorneys. It's a David and Goliath struggle, and it's much more fun to be David. So after uh, in 1985, we made the decision that we wanted to do plaintiffs' work. We had seen too many times where we'd be defending a case and the performance of the plaintiff's attorney was lackluster. I mean, I can think of a case of a young, very pretty woman who lost her hand in a punch press accident. And we filed a motion for summary judgment. There was a very weak brief that was filed in opposition. And we won on summary judgment, but it was not a victory that you celebrate. And we thought we can do better. And we never looked back. And it is much more satisfying to be on the plaintiff side. We're much more appreciated by our clients than we were by the insurance companies. But that provided a lot of fulfillment in navigating through the system to provide legal help for just everyday people.
It's funny because I started out right out of college. My first job was a trial adjuster for Liberty Mutual Insurance Company. As we used to call it, Slippery Mutual back in the day. And I would go to court with the lawyers every day and settle cases or try to settle cases because the insurance companies always wanted to settle and move the cases along. I always marveled at the personal injury lawyers on the plaintiff side because they had to interact with people who are in a lot of pain, suffering, all those things, and they had to almost become a little bit removed from it and present it to the jury in a way that would essentially convince me to pay more money
Right.
in the end, rather than letting go to an actual jury. In the year and a half I did that, only two cases ever went to the actual jury verdict, and we were too paranoid when it got, particularly with the great plaintiffs attorneys. We settled really quick with those guys. I mean, it was so. How did you maneuver that emotional side of dealing with clients as a plaintiff side personal injury lawyer?
That's a good question. I will say that there were certain cases that were very, very difficult, particularly wrongful death cases. Uh, to really do your job as the plaintiff's attorney, you got to know the family. You got to know their family member that had passed away, and it takes a toll on you. And there are really only a certain number of those cases that you have in you. But you have a job to do, and you want to do the best you can for the family. Oftentimes, you feel tremendous pressure to get a result for them. Uh, but it's something that it's something that I enjoy doing.
So, so at 59, you had a health scare that prompted you to make this transition, and over a period of years. If you can, take us through that. And I'm particularly interested, I know the viewers and the listeners will want to know, you know, what was that transition like? How did you navigate the identity as a lawyer to becoming a novelist through that process? Take us through that.
Well, as you said, when I was 59, the doctors, as an incidental finding, found a tumor between my pancreas and my stomach. And I thought, I thought I had pancreatic cancer. As it turned out, the tumor was coming from my stomach. They were able to remove that. And after, it really is a life awakening moment when you think, I don't have that much time left. And how did I want to spend that time? I didn't want to abandon the clients that I had, so I decided I would not accept any new cases. I would finish those that I had. And it took a period of 3 years. And I like to say I was very excited about retirement. I never fully defined myself simply as an attorney. I've always enjoyed the arts, being creative. I played the piano since I was 4 years old. I'd had photography exhibits even before I'd retired. And I knew I wanted to write a book, which I'm sure we'll get into the subject matter. So as I settled each case or tried a case, I would tell my friends, "Hey, I settled one. I just went out in the parking lot and set off a Roman candle." I mean, I was I was excited about having the freedom to do what I wanted to do because there were all these things that, although I'd been able to do them while I was an attorney, I was always shifting my interests. I didn't have the time. So it was not a difficult transition for me simply because there were so many things that I like to do outside of the law.
Well, you're a bit of a unicorn in many ways in that respect, because many of the lawyers that I experienced over the 50 years that I practiced, particularly in larger law firms, they seemed to only live to be lawyers. They had no other interests. And when I ran a law firm and oversaw hundreds of lawyers in the process, I would marvel at how when they got older, they were just basically lost. They didn't know what they were going to do. And they had never cultivated any kind of interests earlier on. And most law firms, they don't even help with that process. They kind of, the door opens in the morning, the lawyers come in, they do their job. They do very little to really give them a fulfilling life if they can, and just basically suck out of them what they can from a practice standpoint. I know that's a sort of a negative way to look at it, but I think that that's very much what most lawyers' journeys end up being, where they get to a point where I like to call, when your use by date occurs, and it'll happen sooner or later, either because of choice or because of something outside your control, and you're left lost. And you obviously are an example of someone who had those kinds of interests and really had a place to go when you make that decision. I
Well, I would also say, number one, my father passed away at age 65, and he never got to enjoy his retirement. My other partner, before he'd been an attorney, worked for Travelers Insurance Company, and his supervisor was about to retire, and they walked into his office, and he was slumped over his desk, dead from a heart attack. So when we practiced law, in our small firm, we always took time for vacations, to coach little league teams, uh, because then, there's a mantra, if not now, when? And so we never felt that we had to spend 70 hours in the office. We did what we needed to do, but we took time to enjoy life.
that's one of the beauties, I think, of the smaller firms. You'd think that intuitively, you think that big, large firms would have the structure to allow for extracurricular activities and the like, but they don't care about that. Smaller
Yeah.
firms are more family oriented, whether they're literally family or not. And they tend to find that time to have a more fulfilling life. It's interesting because a lot of younger lawyers coming out of law school think that I want to run for the big bucks. I want to go to to these big firms and get the big salaries and stuff. And I'll put up with the grind for a while or whatever. Then they just get stuck in the machine and they never are able to get out, as opposed to those who go to smaller firms and build their own practices and like you did and have I think in many ways a much more fulfilling life. I started in a very, very small firm, so I was lucky enough to
Mm.
experience both in the course of my career. But it's a life's choice that lawyers need to be a little more cognizant of when they're coming out of law school and making those moves. And you obviously had a great family behind you to help
Well,
you
I
make
also
that
I also
transition.
need to say that my wife is also an attorney and had
Ah,
built up a finance practice with a large firm in Cleveland. And so when the time came for that I wanted to step aside, she was still working. She was going to work for a few more years, and she'd actually be an excellent person on your podcast because she had built the finance practice and turned it over to members of her team later on. But I had that to fall back on, so a lot of things in my favor.
so that brings me to my next question then. When you went into this period of transition, leaving the practice and going on to writing, what kind of support or resistance did you encounter in that process, and how did you deal with it?
At the time that I decided to step away, the firm, which at one time had been six attorneys, was down to uh, my dad's partner, who was 12 years older than I was, and me. And he was disappointed that I was leaving, but he certainly understood. I certainly had support at home. Uh, my brother and cousin, who had also been members of the firm, had become judges. I mean, they had made a transition into another uh, area. So a little disappointment, but as you mentioned, I stayed on to do the business aspects of the firm for him, and I kept my license current in case, if something happened where he became incapacitated, I could take over.
And do you still dabble at all in the
I
acting
still have
field?
my license, but no, I don't. I've handled a few things pro bono uh, for family members, but no, nothing
Anyways,
on that.
I ask only because it's funny. When I moved down here to North Carolina 5 years ago, when I left the firm, I got barred here in North Carolina because I figured that I should do that just to maintain my lawyer thing. And neighbors started coming to me, and I kept saying, I'm really not practicing anymore. I'm really not practicing anymore. And I found myself doing a lot of favors, which was fine, for folks that were involved. But it's kind of once you got that label, there's people out there who say, oh, I know, David's a lawyer. Go ask David. Go ask Doug. It's something that you really have to be diligent in saying, no, I don't do that anymore. I'm, doing something else. So that's it's an interesting part of the transition I think people face. So you went on to author 4 books now. Tell us a little bit more about the books, what inspired you with these books, and where can people get them, and how's this career going?
Um, when I retired, there was one book that I knew I wanted to write. Uh, and I'll give you a little background on that. In 2005, my mother, we were moving her out of independent living into assisted living. And in that process, I found a file. Here's the file in a closet that had been my father's only defense of a murder case. It was a very celebrated case, uh, and I had been 10 years old when it had happened. It was in 1964, uh, and my dad had been gone since 1985. But for some reason, my mother kept the file, and I opened it, and lo and behold, I saw my father had written out his closing argument. Not that he read his closing argument, but he got it into his mind and so that he could deliver it. And as I read that and worked through that file, it cast a spell on me. I knew I had to write the story. The bathtub murder case, the man was accused of drowning his wife in scalding water. And in 2005, I was still actively in the practice of law. I had done a little bit of work on it, but everyone that was involved in the case was dead. Prosecutor's file was gone. There was no transcript. And so I put it aside until I retired. And once I did, I began my research, newspaper articles. There were a few people that I could still contact. And I had a friend in the Lorain Police Department who had been in charge of the records. I said, is it possible that the police still have the file on this 40 years now? It's years later. And he found the police file in the basement of City Hall. I made a Freedom of Information request, and I had 200 pages of information. And then I also stumbled upon someone who told me uh, a detail that had not been known at trial that would have changed the result of the trial. So I had a very, exciting case to work on. And my father, this 2015, he'd been gone for 30 years. As I started writing the book, this man who'd been out of my life for so long suddenly was in my life every day as I'm writing about it. So that propelled me to the finish line. And the book was self-published, and it did very well. My wife had warned me that may only sell 15 copies of it, but I mean, there was one day where it was a book bub selection, and it sold 6,500 ebooks. And then it went on to win the International Rubric Book Award as the Book of the Year in 2018. So I got my feet wet and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the process, and 3 books followed.
So I'm going to speculate here, but I suspect that as you wrote your books, like you did the first one, that a great deal of time you spent was on research, like typically what a lawyer would do before you actually
Yes,
picked up the pen and started writing.
absolutely. Yes. As I say, there was no transcript for the bathtub murder case, but back in the mid 1960s, the newspapers covered this in incredible detail. Every witness that testified got at least a paragraph. This was big news. And so I was able to get that information. There was also a True Police magazine article about the case. My dad did have a typed up statement of the defendant when he was in jail as to what had happened. So I had bits and pieces, but yes, there was a lot of research. And once I started writing, it took about 4 months. It's almost as if the book wrote itself. I had another lawyer friend who was also an author, and I was real excited when I finished the manuscript. You know, and he said, "Well, Dave, here's what I would do." He said, "I would take 4 months off, don't look at it, and then rewrite it."
Mm.
And he said, and then take a couple more months and rewrite it again. And that was terrific advice because you see things 3 or 4 months later oh, that's not necessary, or I need to expand on this, or this is not clear. So I did all those things and hired some people to help me. My wife read it 5 times. It was a great project to I had a new occupation, and as I told people, I finally found out what I want to do when I grow up.
One of the things that I know you will agree with is that when someone comes to you, it'll often say to you, I have an idea for a book. And you almost want to say to them, well, you better be prepared for a long process, a painful process, and you better not have a thin skin because you've got to take the criticism to make a really good product when you're all done.
Right, right,
So
right.
do you remember this case when you were 10 years old at all?
Yes, yeah. Actually, the book begins uh, with a phone ringing at our house about 11 o'clock, December 20th, 1963. I'm 10 years old, my brother is 12, and our parents are not home. And I answer the phone, and a man with a very gruff voice says, "Hey, is Ray there?" I said, "I'm sorry, he's not here right now." "Damn it, I'm in the jail. I need to talk to him." I said, "Well, he's not." Clunk. So I think it's ironic that, 50 years later, I'm writing the story of the man who I talked to over the phone when I was 10 years old. So, yes, I had a connection with it. I followed it in the newspaper. I can remember my dad meeting with his associates at home. And I remember asking my dad, "Did he do it?" And and he said, "David, I don't think he did it. He vehemently denies it. But you never know for sure. But
Well,
yes, I remember the case very, very well.
I'm not gonna ask you how it all ended because I'll let people find out on their own
Right. Then
by
they won't
buying
read
the
the
book.
book.
But that was in the Truman Capote, in cold blood kind of format. And you did that for your next 2 books, right?
Right.
And where were the inspiration for the next 2?
Well, the second was actually my wife's mentor, another attorney, about 10 years older than we are. And she had gone to a um, Burger King drive-through around 5:30 at night in December, put in her order, and a man came with a gun, put it to her head, and uh, it was a robbery gone wrong. She was shot. And she and her husband were at my first book signing, and her husband said, "You ought to do Marie's story." And I said, "That's a great idea," because her story is not so much the crime and how she dealt with the legal system, but how she came to overcome her anger and her fear. of what had happened to her and how she reconciled it. And it's a beautiful, I mean, the last chapter, it's a beautiful story of of gaining closure and gaining closure in a way people would never expect. And so that was the inspiration. She's an inspiring person, and I was glad that I was able to tell her story. And that's The Edge of Malice. That's the second book. The third book, I took a different tact. There was a case that was in the newspaper for the last 3 decades. It was two people that had been accused of molesting children. One was a Head Start bus driver, and one was allegedly her boyfriend. And they continually said that they hadn't done it, and there were some articles in the newspaper 5, 6 years later that really threw their conviction completely in doubt. And I wanted to look at that and find out. I wanted to come to some resolution. So I got the transcript. I started working on that case, and in fact, it is a case of a horrible wrongful conviction, and it tells the story. Things happened while I was writing the book. There was a motion for a new trial some 30 years after the case had been decided, and I once again, I think I'm shining the light on another aspect of the legal system when it goes desperately wrong.
And did you get a chance to actually meet the
Oh
accused?
yeah, oh yeah. Actually, one of the woman came to one of my book signings.
They should come to the
uh,
book signing for that book. That's what they wanted.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so your latest book, your newest book that just came out this summer, takes it's more fictional than it is based on
Right.
an actual case, right? So why did you make that transition? And in terms of writing that book compared to writing books based on historical case, did you find it more challenging, less challenging, or take us through that process?
I think it's much more challenging to write fiction than it is to write nonfiction, because with nonfiction you have a story. It's set. You're allowed to use your imagination to fill in some gaps. With fiction, you have to create a story that is believable, that takes your readers with you. I tried writing this same story before I wrote my third book, and I gave it to my wife to look at. And she read it and she said, "You can't ever publish this. This is horrible." She's my biggest advocate, but also but she could also be a critic. And so I asked one of my editors. I said, "Okay, give me the straight scoop." And she said, "Well, it's not your best writing. You do better with narrative nonfiction." Uh, so that's when I wrote the third book. But I didn't want to give up on this on the fiction, and I got some comments from my editor. I replotted it. I added different characters. I changed the story, and I handed it to my wife again, and it was almost as if it was radioactive because she did not want to tell me that she didn't like it. So I, we're on vacation. We got the grandchildren. She's reading it every night, giving me absolutely no feedback as to whether she likes it or not. We're watching some Disney movie, and she hands the transcript to me, or the manuscript, and she has a big star on it. She
Ah,
said, "You did it." She said, "I don't know how you did it, but this is really, really good." And so the story itself, there was a case that we had in our office that is the genesis for the wrongful death case. It's a uh, psychiatrist who's sued by the parents of a 15-year-old girl who died by suicide. And there are some similarities to an earlier case, but then I've also it's so different. It's just the main idea for the story. But this book deals a lot with the ethical challenges that lawyers face in cases, and so I think it's interesting for a reader to see uh, where these pressures come in and how the attorneys resolve them, or if they don't resolve them.
You hit on something there that I think is an experience when lawyers go from lawyers to writers. They have to turn their attention to the idea that they're going to have to accept rejection. When we're practicing as lawyers, we really didn't get a lot of rejection. When you decide to make that quantum leap into writing, you get a lot of rejection. I remember when I wrote my first novel, I had written a trade book that had done really well and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I sent it to the publisher that did the trade book. And I think, what do you think? And I get back the manuscript with a note on the top saying, stick to trade books. And I was devastated, like you were. And my biggest critic of all my books has always been my wife, and I want that criticism, but it's hard to take sometimes. But I
Yes,
always
it
give her
is.
that. I always give her the manuscript with a little bit of trepidation, and
Absolutely.
I'll see it sitting on the end table, and I'll see where the marker is or where the thing is, the page is turned over. I'm going, I'm not going to talk to her yet. I can't talk to her yet because it's got to get through it. But it's a whole different world. As lawyers, see, people think, well, lawyers write stuff all the time, so when they become writers, that must be a natural transition. It's not. It is really a different world.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so
Well,
it's
I would also say, I don't know, did you do trial work when you were an
no, I was
attorney?
a transactional lawyer.
Okay, all right. Well, I will say one of the nice things about writing about trials is in the courtroom, everything is so unpredictable. I mean, the judge's rulings, the witnesses state, what they say on the stand, the jurors that happen to be deciding your case. But when you're writing about it, you have control of all those things. The judge rules the way you want. The witnesses say exactly what you have programmed. So it's much easier to write about a trial than to actually be in a trial, simply because you have that control aspect, and that's what makes it fun.
No, yeah, I don't write. My novels are not about legal procedures. There's some law in it and stuff, but
Yeah.
one of the things I write thrillers, and the great satisfaction is I can kill people and not really kill them. And if I don't like you, your name's in the book and you're dead. So it's a whole different, sort of cathartic exercise when you write those kinds of books. But it is a cathartic thing, and it's a wonderful process to do. I always encourage people to do it. Just be prepared for the process. Okay, let me ask you this question then. A lot of the viewers and the listeners of this podcast and folks that I consult with, their biggest question, their biggest fear is always, advice on how to make that step out, how to decide that it's what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. What advice would you give to someone who comes to you and says, hey, David, I'm thinking of leaving. What are your thoughts?
I would first ask them what their outside interests are. I mean, once you retire, you need something that gets you excited about getting up in the morning. And it may be, and I mean, I've talked to people who are thinking about retiring. Some of them have a goal to be in the best physical shape that they've ever been in, and they substitute workouts for going to the office. Some see it as an opportunity to volunteer, to spend more time with the grandchildren, to travel. I would want to quiz them about what is it that you think would excite you once you're retired. And, I would also, and I hate to say this, but if someone has no outside interests, if they love what they're doing as a lawyer, uh, and they're competent at it, I would say keep working. Uh, and if you have outside interests, and you can develop those, and you can be excited about them, then the time's come to pursue those things.
Yeah, I can't think of any better advice. I mean, that's the questions that I often ask, the same kinds of questions. People that come to me, and the sad stories are the ones that really haven't developed that interest, but who really don't like practicing law. Those are the real tragic cases.
Yes, yeah, I can
It's
see
sad.
that.
We
Yeah.
see that. We see that in our profession all the time. And in my years of practicing, two of my partners and I had many partners. I was in a big law firm who I didn't know them that well, but two of them committed suicide.
Oh my.
It's a profession that has its dark places that you need to think about that as you're practicing law and coming up through the profession. So to conclude, you've had a wonderful arc of practicing law and defining success there, and then moving on and defining your new success now. How would you differ the sense of success you had when you started and what your sense of success and legacy is today?
Well, first of all, I don't think I have a definition of success. I always look at my life as a work in progress. I can always be a better husband, father, grandfather, better neighbor. And that's still always my focus. And so in terms of success, I've never uh, looked at my accomplishments in law, and I don't really look at what I've done since leaving the practice. I just, as I say, I think I view myself as a work in progress, and I value my relationships. And if I've had success there, that's not for me to judge. I think it's for other people to judge. So I hate to avoid
No,
answering
that's
your
okay.
question, but that's kind of the way I feel on that.
There's a funny visual I use in when I do my presentations to groups, and in the end I have a tombstone with RIP on it. And so that the audience will sort of see that and take back a little bit. And I go, no, it doesn't stand for rest in peace. It stands for relevancy in progress. And that's kind of what we need to do, is to
Yeah.
find that relevancy and not so much worry, as you said, about success per se. It's almost like the field of dreams. If you can be relevant and stay relevant with outside interests or whatever it is you're doing, your life will be fine. If you can't find that, then you need to find help to help you find that. But in the end of the
Yeah.
day, your answer is terrific. It's not about success per se. It's about yourself, and let others then judge you as they will judge you, whatever that's going to be, some things you can't control. So, David, thank you very much for being a
Well,
part of
thank
this
you.
tonight. Some great comments. I know the listeners and the viewers will take some real lessons out of that, some real nuggets. And I wish you the best, and with your grandchildren, your children, your wife, your books, your everything that you're doing. It's a wonderful story. Thank you, David, for being on the show.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Dawn to Dusk podcast. You can learn more on building and transitioning a multi-million-dollar law practice in Doug's book, From Dawn to Dusk: How to Build a Multi-Million-Dollar Law Practice and Then Give It Away. If you're interested in working with Doug, suggesting future guests, or have questions you'd like Doug to ask guests in upcoming episodes, reach out to him at douglas.wood@wood.law, or visit his website at dawntodusk.wood.law. And if you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your peers. Until next time, we appreciate your viewership.